Excerpts from A Defense of Poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley, first published in 1840. In the youth of the world, men dance and sing and imitate natural objects, observing in these actions, as in all others, a certain rhythm or order. And, although all men observe a similar, they do not observe the same order in the motions of the dance, in the melody of the song, in the combinations of language, in the series of their imitations of natural objects. For there's a certain order or rhythm belonging to each of these classes of mimetic representation, from which the hearer and the spectator receive an intenser and purer pleasure than from any other. The sense of approximation to this order has been called taste by modern writers. Every man in the infancy of art observes an order which approximates more or less closely to that from which his highest delight results. But the diversity is not sufficiently marked, as that its gradations should be sensible, except in those instances where the predominance of this faculty of approximation to the beautiful, for so we may be permitted to name this relation between the highest pleasure and its cause, is very great. Those in whom it exists in excess are poets, in the most universal sense of the word, and the pleasure resulting from the manner in which they express the influence of society or nature upon their own minds communicates itself to others and gathers a sort of reduplication from that community. Their language is vitally metaphorical. That is, it marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension until the words which represent them become, through time, signs for portions or classes of thoughts instead of pictures of integral thoughts. And then, if no new poets should arise to create afresh the associations which have been thus disorganized, language will be dead to all the nobler pursuits of human intercourse. These similitudes or relations are finely said by Lord Bacon to be the same footsteps of nature impressed upon the various subjects of the world. And he considers the faculty which perceives them as the storehouse of axioms common to all knowledge. In the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet, because language itself is poetry, and to be a poet is to apprehend the true and the beautiful, in a word, the good, which exists in the relation subsisting first between existence and perception, and secondly between perception and expression. Every original language near to its source is in itself the chaos of a cyclic poem. The copiousness of lexicography and the distinctions of grammar are the works of a later age, and are merely the catalogue and form of the creations of poetry. But poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only the authors of language and music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting, they are the institutor of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts of life and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and true that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world which is called religion. Hence, all original religions are allegorical, or susceptible of allegory, and, like Janus, have a double face of true and false. Poets, according to the circumstances of the age and the nation in which they appeared, were called, in the earlier epochs of the world, legislators or prophets. A poet essentially comprises and unites both of these characteristics, for he not only beholds intensely the present as it is and discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered, but he beholds the future in the present, and his thoughts are the germs of the flower and the fruit of latest time. Not that I assert poets to be prophets in the gross sense of the word, or that they can foretell the form as surely as they foreknow the spirit of events. Such is the pretense of superstition, which would make poetry an attribute of prophecy, rather than prophecy an attribute of poetry. A poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one. As far as relates to his conceptions, time and place and number are not. The grammatical forms which express the moods of time and the difference of person and the disjunctions of place are convertible with respect to the highest poetry without injuring it as poetry. And the choruses of Aeschylus, the Book of Job, and Dante's Paradise would afford, more than any other writings, examples of this fact, if the limits of this essay did not forbid citation. A poem is the very image of life expressed in its eternal truth. There's this difference between a story and a poem, that a story is a catalogue of detached facts, which have no other connection than time, place, circumstance, cause, and effect. The other is the creation of actions according to the unchangeable forms of human nature, as existing in the mind of the Creator, which is the image of all other minds. The one is partial, and applies only to a definite period of time, and a certain combinations of events which can never again recur. The other is universal, and contains within itself the germ of a relation to whatever motives or actions have place in the possible varieties of human nature. Time, which destroys the beauty and the use of the story of particular facts, stripped of the poetry which should invest them, augments that of poetry, and forever develops new and wonderful applications of the eternal truth which it contains. Hence, epitomes have been called the moths of history. They eat out the poetry of it. A story of particular facts is a mirror which obscures and distorts that which should be beautiful. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. The parts of a composition may be poetical without the composition as a whole being a poem. A single sentence may be considered as a whole, though it may be found in the midst of a series of unassimilated portions. A single word even may be the spark of inextinguishable thought. And thus all the great historians, Herodotus, Plutarch, Livy, were poets. Although the plan of these writers, especially that of Livy, restrained them from developing this faculty in its highest degree, they made copious and ample amends for their subjection by filling all the interstices of their subjects with living images. Having determined what is poetry and who are poets, let us proceed to estimate its effects upon society. Poetry is ever accompanied with pleasure. All spirits on which it falls open themselves to receive the wisdom which is mingled with its delight. In the infancy of the world, neither poets themselves nor their auditors are fully aware of the excellence of poetry, for it acts in a divine and unapprehended manner, beyond and above consciousness, and it is reserved for future generations to contemplate and measure the mighty cause and effect in all the strength and splendor of their union. Even in modern times, no living poet ever arrived at the fullness of his fame. The jury which sits in judgment upon a poet, belonging as he does to all time, must be composed of his peers. It must be impaneled by time from the selectest of the wise of many generations. A poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds. His auditors are as men entranced by the melody of an unseen musician, who feel they are moved and softened, yet know not whence or why. The poems of Homer and his contemporaries were the delight of infant Greece. They were the elements of that social system which is the column upon which all succeeding civilization has reposed. Homer embodied the ideal perfection of his age in human character, nor can we doubt that those who read his verses were awakened to an ambition of becoming like Achilles, Hector, and Ulysses. The truth and beauty of friendship, patriotism, and preserving devotion to an object were unveiled to the depths in these immortal creations. The sentiments of the auditors must have been refined and enlarged by a sympathy with such great and lovely impersonations, until from admiring they imitated, and from imitation they identified themselves with the objects of their admiration. The whole objection of the immorality of poetry rests upon a misconception of the manner in which poetry acts to produce the moral improvement of man. Ethical science arranges the elements which poetry has created and propounds schemes and propounds examples of civic and domestic life, nor is it for want of admirable doctrines that men hate and despise and censure and deceive and subjugate one another. But poetry acts in another and diviner manner. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents, and the impersonations clothed in its Elysian light stand thenceforward in the minds of those who have once contemplated them, as memorials of that gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and actions with which it coexists. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful that exists in thought, action, or person not our own. A man, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and many others. The pains and pleasure of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, and which form new intervals and interstices where void forever craves fresh food. Poetry strengthens the faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. A poet, therefore, would do ill to embody his own conceptions of right and wrong, which are usually those of his place and time, in his poetical creations, which participate in neither. We have more moral, political, and historical wisdom than we know how to reduce into practice. We have more scientific and economical knowledge than can be accommodated to the just distribution of the produce which it multiplies. The poetry in these systems of thought is concealed by the accumulation of facts and calculating processes. There's no want of knowledge respecting what is wisest and best in morals, government, and political economy, or at least what is wiser and best than what men now practice and endure. But we let I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage. We want the creative faculty to imagine that which we know. We want the generous impulse to act that which we imagine. We want the poetry of life. Our calculations have outrun conception. We have eaten more than we can digest. The cultivation of those sciences which have enlarged the limit of the empire of man over the external world has, for want of the poetical faculty, proportionately circumscribed those of the internal world. And man, having enslaved the elements, remains himself a slave. To what but a cultivation of the mechanical arts in degree disproportionate to the presence of the creative faculty, which is the basis of all knowledge, is to be attributed the abuse of all invention for abridging and combining labor, to the exasperation of the inequality of mankind? From what other cause has it arisen that the discoveries which should have lightened have added a weight upon the curse imposed upon Adam? Poetry and the principle of self, of which money is the visible incarnation, are the God and mammon of the world. The functions of the poetical faculty are twofold. By one, it creates new materials of knowledge and power and pleasure. By the other, it engenders in the mind a desire to reproduce and arrange them according to a certain rhythm and order, which may be called the beautiful and the good. The cultivation of poetry is never more to be desired than at periods when, from an excess of the selfish and calculating principle, the accumulation of the materials of external life exceed the quantity of the power of assimilating them into the internal laws of human nature. The body has then become too unwieldy for that which animates it. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science, and that to which all science must be referred. It is at the same time the root and the blossom of all other systems of thought. It is that from which they spring, and that which adorns all, and that which, if blighted, denies the fruit and the seed, and withholds from the barren world the nourishment and the succession of the scions of the tree of life. It is the perfect and consummate surface and bloom of all things. It is the odor and the color of the rose to the texture of the elements which compose it, as the form and splendor of unfaded beauty to the secrets of anatomy and corruption. What were virtue, love, patriotism, friendship? What were the scenery of this beautiful universe which we inhabit? What were our consolations on this side of the grave, and what were our aspirations beyond it, if poetry did not ascend to bring light and fire from those eternal regions where the owl-winged faculty of calculation dare not ever soar? Poetry is not like reasoning, a power to be exerted according to the determination of will. A man cannot say, "I will compose poetry." The greatest poet cannot say it, for the mind in creation is a fading coal, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, like the color of a flower which fades and changes as it developed, and the conscious portions of our nature are unprophetic either of its approach or departure. Could this influence be durable in its original purity and force? It is impossible to predict the greatness of the results. But When composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline. And the most glorious poetry that ever has been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conceptions of the poet. Poetry is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. We are aware of evanescent visitations of thought and feeling, sometimes associated with place or person, sometimes regarding our own mind alone, and always arising unforeseen and departing unbidden, but elevating and delightful beyond all expression, so that even in the desire and the regret they leave, there cannot but be pleasure, participating as it does in the nature of its object. It is as it were the interpretation of a diviner nature through our own, but its footsteps are like those of a wind over the sea, which the coming calm erases, and whose traces remain only as on the wrinkled sand which paves it. These and corresponding conditions of being are experienced principally by those who have the most delicate sensibility and the most enlarged imagination, and the state of mind produced by them is at war with every base desire. The enthusiasm of virtue, love, patriotism, and friendship is essentially linked with such emotions, and while they last, self appears as what it is, an atom to the universe. Poets are not only subject to these experiences as spirits of the most refined organization, but they can color all they combined with the evanescent hues of this ethereal world. A word, a trait in the representation of a scene, or a passion will touch the enchanted chord and reanimate in those who have experienced these emotions the sleeping, the cold, the buried image of the past. Poetry thus makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in the world. It arrests the vanishing apparitions which haunt the interluminations of life, and, unveiling them, or in any language or in form, sends them forth among mankind, bearing sweet news of kindred joy to those with whom their sisters abide. Abide because there is no portal of expression from the caverns of the spirit which they inhabit into the universe of things. Poetry redeems from decay the visitation of the divinity in man. Poetry turns all things to loveliness. It exalts the beauty of that which is most beautiful, and it adds beauty to that which is most deformed. It marries exultation and horror, grief and pleasure, eternity and change. It subdues to union under its light yoke all irreconcilable things. It transmutes all that it touches, and every form moving within the radiance of its presence is changed by wondrous sympathy to an incarnation of the spirit which it breathes. Its secret alchemy turns to potable gold the poisonous waters which flow from death through life. It strips the veil of familiarity from the world and lays bare the naked and sleeping beauty which is the spirit of its forms. All things exist as they are perceived, at least in relation to the percipient. The mind is its own place, and of itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. But poetry defeats the curse which binds us to be subjected to the accident of surrounding impressions. And whether it spreads its own figured curtain or withdraws life's dark veil from before the scene of things, it equally creates for us a being within our being. It makes us the inhabitants of a world to which the familiar world is a chaos. It reproduces the common world of which we are portions and percipients, and it plunges from our inward sight the film of familiarity which obscures us from the wonder of our being. It compels us to feel that which we perceive, and to imagine that which we know. It creates anew the universe, after it has been annihilated in our minds by the recurrence of impressions blunted by reiteration. For the literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever been preceded or accompanied by a great and free development of the national will has arisen, as it were, from a new birth. In spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit, our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements, and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpass beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work in a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions regarding man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good which they are the ministers. But even while they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve that power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled by the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations. For it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. Poets are hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.